Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video, and today we're doing a comparison a lot of you have been asking for. Today we're looking at the brand new Fujifilm X100 Mark VI, and we're comparing it to the Leica Q3. If you're new to the channel, I am a portrait photographer that primarily shoots with Sony and Leica, and I recently picked up the Fujifilm X100 Mark VI. As a matter of fact, I bought into the hype train. I think I woke up at 2 in the morning to pre-order the camera so I could be one of the first, and here we are. If you want to check out the first impressions of the Fujifilm X100 Mark VI, feel free to check it out on the channel. I also do have a first impressions and a review of the Leica Q3. Now, both these cameras have one thing in common. They're extremely hard to get. They've been sold out since they launched, and they're very popular cameras. As a matter of fact, they have two things in common. They're also fixed lens cameras, which means they're not interchangeable and they both come with a fixed lens. The commonalities stop there because the differences start getting pretty big after that, especially with price points. The X100 Mark VI retails for $1,600 and the Leica Q3 retails for $6,000. So the Fujifilm is not a cheap camera, but compared to the Leica, it is an absolute bargain. So for this comparison, it's going to be a fun one because the reality is they're in two very different categories. Like I do with all my videos, I will be providing images for you to download and check out yourself because YouTube will compress these files and you won't see exactly what I'm seeing. So I highly encourage you, download the samples and do the comparison yourself so you can see the differences between these two cameras. For today's video, I'm primarily going to focus on build quality, design, autofocus, and then of course the most important part, image quality. Throughout the video, I'll be posting up photos I've taken with both cameras, and then of course, when I do the image quality comparison, we'll do an in-depth pixel peeping session that we can nerd out on. So with that said, let's kick things off with build quality and design. Both these cameras, like I mentioned, are fixed lens cameras, but they both take a different design philosophy. Starting with a Fuji takes a retro approach with their camera and has tons of buttons and dials. It looks like a traditional rangefinder. As a matter of fact, it looks closer to a Leica than the Leica Q3. It mimics the M-body design, and of course, the M-body design is a rangefinder design. So you have this retro style that also comes in silver and black. I personally love the silver. I think it complements it so well, and it just looks stunning. Now, as far as the buttons and dials, they are useful, and it's also helpful to just always be able to see them without having to go into menus and screens. And overall, I really like the design. The camera is on the smaller side, so if you're like me, I'm actually around 6'3" and I have larger hands. The camera's pretty uncomfortable to hold, so I highly encourage you to pick up a grip to make it easier to hold and kind of just fit in the hand. I am using the small grip here, and it just completely transforms the ergonomics of the camera. Other than that, my only other complaint is the buttons in the back of this camera are on the smaller side, so they're not necessarily very easy or fun to use, and that's just a minor complaint. As far as build quality goes, this camera is weather sealed if you have a filter on it, and overall, it feels great for the price. Looking at the Leica Q3, it actually takes the opposite approach, and you have less buttons and dials, but you have a simpler and more elegant design. The menu system is intuitive, and this camera just is easy to pick up and use. The camera is also small and lightweight. Now, it is larger than the Fujifilm, and the primary bulk of that is the Summilux 28mm f1.7 lens. Now this camera is a full frame camera, which means it needs more glass to cover the sensor, and that's where the extra size comes into play. This camera is still weather sealed, and you don't need any lens filters or adapters. It's just weather sealed out of the box. It's made out of aluminum, and overall it feels very well built. I will say, owning a Leica Q2 and now owning a Leica Q3, even though the camera is built well, the paint on the body and the edges of the body are just very easy to wear off. It's very easy to kind of scratch this camera, so it feels great in the hand. It's sturdy, but it is kind of prone to scratches and paint chips on the edges of the camera. Even though this camera is a bit larger than the X100 Mark VI, it's still not the most comfortable to hold if you have large hands like myself. So I also encourage you to pick up a grip, or in my case, I have a leather protector and a thumb support to make the camera easier to hold. I don't think there's a winner here. It's just two different design philosophies, two different approaches, and they both work for each camera. Moving on to autofocus. This is an interesting one. So with the Leica Q3, Leica launched their Phase Detect autofocusing system, which was supposed to improve the autofocusing speed, accuracy, and tracking over the Leica Q2. And it did that. The camera is faster, it is snappier, and it does focus better. It's still not up to par to like a Sony or a Canon, but the camera does a pretty solid job. As a matter of fact, I really don't have complaints with autofocus. You can also track now, and it does a good job at it. And more than likely, you're going to get shots in focus, tack sharp. What surprised me here is actually the X100 Mark VI. The autofocus on the X100 Mark VI is iffy, and I don't understand why. Using phase detect, eye detect, and continuous autofocus just yields bad results for me. It will constantly miss autofocus. It will front focus, back focus, focus on the background. It's literally unpredictable, and I don't understand it. When using this camera with single point autofocus, it does a lot better and it nails focus a lot more often. But tracking, phase detect, and continuous is just a recipe for disaster. And to be honest, it's very frustrating. It's an APS-C sensor, so you actually have a little bit more depth of field over the full frame sensor on the Q3. And the fact that you're missing focus so much, it completely kind of ruins the experience at times and makes you not want to use the camera. I think the good thing is it could be solved via firmware. Again, if you use this camera in single point autofocus, it's pretty accurate and spot on. It's just the continuous tracking and phase detect that I can't seem to solve why I have so many issues with. So when it comes down to autofocus, I can't believe I'm going to say this, the Leica Q3 is a winner and is significantly better than the X100 Mark VI. With that being said, I know everybody's here to see the image quality differences. So let's go ahead and do a pixel peeping session. Let's look at some images, and then let's come back and come up with our final conclusions on these two cameras. Let's get this pixel peeping session started. So here on the left, we have the Leica. On the right, we have the Fuji. And to set some ground rules, all these photos were taken without a tripod, so the composition might be a little different, but they were all taken with the exact same settings. I did apply my preset to all these images, and the only tweaks I made were I try to get them to match as close as possible from a white balance perspective, and I cropped all the Q3 images to a 35mm perspective for this comparison. Like I've mentioned before, I will be providing these images for you to download, so if you want to play with the files yourself, feel free to do so. With that being said, let's kick things off. Again, on the left we have the Leica, on the right we have the Fuji. Looking at these images without pixel peeping, they both look identical. They look the same. There might be a little differences in color, but nothing major. As a matter of fact, when you zoom in, that's when you start noticing some of the differences. The Leica is a sharper image. There's more detail, more resolution. The Fuji doesn't look bad, but it does not have that biting sharpness. And I mentioned this in my Fuji review, and you're going to see it here in a lot of the images. And I'm not sure if it's the lens not being able to resolve the 40 megapixels or the camera just misses focus a lot. We'll determine that later. So zooming out, these images, like I said, they both look very similar. Leica is sharper though and has more detail. Let's look at another set of images. When I walked past this fence, I automatically thought this would be a great image to take for this comparison so we can see the resolution and detail of both these cameras. Again, when you look at it from this perspective though, both images look almost the same. You can see some of the differences in the compression of the lenses and probably the angle I took the photo in. But when you zoom in, again, you see how the Leica is just a significantly sharper image. There's more detail, there's more texture in this photo. And it's no surprise, right? The Leica does have a bigger lens, more megapixels, and here it's really flexing its muscle. It's a sharper image with more detail, more resolution. But how does it do with people? So let's take a look at another set of images. So here on the left, we have the Leica. On the right, we have the Fuji. And one thing to point out, both these photos were taken at ISO 800, but I had to adjust the Fuji because it was underexposed. So Fuji does this thing with their ISOs where it's not like for like. So for some reason, their 800 is more like a 640. It's a little bit underexposed, and they've done this for a while. And I'll show you here after we do this comparison what it looks like without the adjustments, but with the same settings, the Fuji is a darker image. As a matter of fact, even in this photo, you can kind of see it in the hair, but looking at this portrait, both look really, really good. When you zoom in, the Fuji actually is probably one of the sharpest photos I've taken with the X100 Mark VI, but the Q3 is still sharper and has more detail. And you can see how there's more detail in the hair, in the shadows, the dynamic range of the Q3. But when you don't pixel peep, both photos look very, very close. So let me actually show you what this photo looks like on the Q3 uncropped and without the exposure adjustments on the Fuji, so you can see some of those differences. So here we have the Q3 uncropped and the Fuji without the exposure bump. And again, I think to point out the hair, you can see how just the photo is a darker photo, even though it's the exact same setting. So this is just how Fuji does ISO, and they've been doing this for years, but I needed to point that out. Another thing, it's just crazy how much more you get in frame with the Q3 and the 28mm focal length, and the power of 61 megapixels, because you're able to crop, still get a ton of detail and resolution and just flexibility. So this truly shows you the different perspectives of both cameras. But let's take a look at some more images. So here we have another boring one, but this is an important one because it shows the exposure differences again. You can see same settings on both. The Fuji on the right is darker. When you zoom in, the Leica has more detail, more resolution, a little bit of the same that we've been seeing, but I wanted to use this photo so you can see the exposure differences and how ISO 800 is not necessarily ISO 800 like in other cameras. So it's a little bit more underexposed on the Fuji. But even though the Leica is sharper and has more detail, the Fuji definitely holds its own. It's no slouch and it still looks pretty solid in my opinion. So let's take a look at another set of images where the X100 Mark VI actually really impressed me. So here in this set of images, we have the Leica on the left, the Fuji on the right, and what I really wanted to point out in this set of images is just the background blur. The bokeh is actually almost identical. Now, again, I'm shooting the Q3 at f2, not f1.7, but the fact that this is a full frame camera versus an APS-C camera and the bokeh looks this close is really, really impressive for the X100 Mark VI, and I think a massive, massive win. Again, both photos have their thing, right? The Q3 is cropped here, it is shooting wider, but as a whole, I'm really impressed by the X100 Mark VI here. Let's take a look at another set of images. So here we have another portrait, and if you zoom in, you're gonna see a little bit of the same. So the Q3 is a sharper image, more detail, more resolution. The Fuji is just not, it's not sharp. I don't know how to explain it. I talked about this in my review, or my first impressions, I should say. It's got like a, again, I'm not sure if it's missing focus or just the lens, but it's just not sharp. It's not unsharp either. So, I mean, it's flattering for the skin tones, but I don't know what it is. Zooming out, both photos look almost identical. Here, I definitely got the white balance off a little bit. The Leica is more green, but that's adjustable. And the Leica is sharper when you pixel peep, but when you look at them from this perspective, they look extremely similar. Let's take a look at another set of images. Again, in this set of photos, the Leica on the left, Fuji on the right, both look almost identical. When you pixel peep, the Leica is a sharper image, clearly in focus, and the Fuji is just the hair soft. And that's just the trend of this comparison, especially when shooting people, is when you see it the most because, again, zooming out, not a big deal. You zoom in, you see it. Let's go ahead and go to another photo where you're gonna see that it's actually only when you shoot people that you have that, which makes me think it's the autofocus. In this set of images, the Leica's on the left, Fuji's on the right, and they look almost identical again. When you zoom in where we focused, both photos look extremely sharp. And it's photos like this that make me realize, like, is the Fuji missing focus? Because I think here the Fuji looks very sharp, tons of detail. I think it holds its own with the Leica, but never with people. So my hunch is it's the autofocus system, because in photos like this, they're just way too similar. Let's take a look at two more sets of photos and then have our final conclusions. Okay, on this photo, we have the Leica on the left, Fuji on the right. I mentioned in the beginning that both photos have the same preset, same edit, and you're gonna see that the Fuji just has more vibrant greens here, and that's something to kind of note with the color science. Even though for the most part they match pretty well, there is subtle differences between both cameras. Looking at sharpness and detail here, I think the Leica is a sharper photo. There's more texture, more detail, but the Fuji holds its own. And to actually show you some of the differences here, so let me zoom out. Obviously, like I mentioned, this is the Leica cropped. Let me show you what the Leica uncropped looks like. And I think that's where you're really gonna get impressed. So here you can see the Leica uncropped, and you can just see how much more you get in the frame. And again, this is where the flexibility is really, really nice because you have 61 megapixels and you're able to really crop into photos and just have that resolving power and the detail. and you just have unlimited options almost when shooting with 61 megapixels and a wide angle lens like this 28 millimeter Summilux. And I think that's a major, major advantage of the Q3. So now let's go ahead and go to a final image. Q3 on the left, X100 Mark VI on the right. I saw this wheel and automatically thought the texture here would be great for this comparison. So let's go ahead and pixel peep. And sure enough, it is great. On the Q3, you can see the resolving power, the texture, the detail. This camera's sharp. There's no denying it. The Fuji is no slouch, but it's just not as sharp as the Q3. And it's photos like this where you can truly see the texture kind of just pop out of the frame here with the Q3. And on the Fuji, you don't see that. So that doesn't make it a bad camera. It's just not the sharpest. With that said, let's go ahead and wrap up our final thoughts and talk about these two incredible cameras. So there you have it. Like I said in the beginning of this video, this is meant to be a fun comparison because the reality is these two cameras are targeting two different segments. At $1,600, the Fujifilm X100 Mark VI is an incredible camera that just has tons of versatility. It's fun to use, has a sexy design, and the only thing holding it back from being, I think, legendary is the freaking autofocus. And Fujifilm released an update because that is the last missing piece to make this camera absolutely incredible. But when you look at the Q3, Leica's really built an incredible camera. 60 megapixels, full frame with a 28 millimeter Summilux lens. It's sharp, it's lightweight, it's fun to use. I haven't even talked about the Leica Photos app. It changes the way you can edit photos on the go. The Leica Q3, I've said it before, I think is the perfect everyday camera, the perfect travel camera. There's so many great things about it. And both these cameras win in their segments. Now, if you're comparing them like we are today and you wanted to pick a winner, it also comes down to what you want to carry with you every day. The Leica Q3 will give you sharper results. You saw it. It'll give you the full frame sensor. It'll give you better low light capabilities, better autofocusing for now. It's the better camera, but you are giving up a little bit of size and weight. It is a little bit larger, a little bit heavier. It doesn't fit as easy in camera bags or coat pockets like the Fujifilm X100 Mark VI does. Another thing to think about is the price point. Do you feel comfortable enough carrying a $6,000 camera wherever you're traveling or wherever you're going? Or would you feel more comfortable with a more discreet camera like the X100 Mark VI that looks more like a point and shoot than the Q3? It all comes down to preference. So I want to end the video like this. Both these cameras are the best in their segment. It's hard to beat the Fujifilm X100 Mark VI with its 40 megapixel sensor, its compact size, its retro design at its price point. And it's also hard to beat the Leica Q3 with its 60 megapixel full frame sensor, 28 millimeter Summilux lens, the Leica Photos app, which like I said, will change the way you edit on the go, weather seal design. Both these cameras are stunners, both these cameras are fun to use, and both these cameras will make any photographer incredibly happy. So with that being said, hopefully y'all enjoy this comparison. Hopefully y'all download some of the files I'm providing down below so you can check out the files yourself. And also if you're interested, my presets are also available in the link down below. As always guys, please smash the like button, please subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good one guys. Peace.